Isn't it quaint? Jesus is a botanist and a bird watcher. Very sweet. Got nothing to do with real economics. Unfortunately for us, to dismiss Jesus here is to miss the key to his alternative cosmology. Jesus is likely pointing out these positive object lessons as he's walking through a field with his disciples. The truth is close at hand. If we pause long enough from our civilizational preoccupations to encounter what Aquinas famously called the book of nature, or what Luther speaks of as God writing the gospel on the trees, flowers, clouds, and stars, this is not utopian ranting, friends. No. Utopia was Thomas More's contemptuous word for the world that does not, indeed cannot exist. Jesus is talking about a very real world that exists right in front of us and has been concretely existing for billions of years, as Tevin pointed out. It is the sensuous, embodied, alive, mystical world of the biosphere. And it's right at hand, but we don't have eyes to see it, because we're utterly distracted by the works of our own hands, by our built environments, and because we have objectified and commodified nature beyond recognition. So, here comes the catechism. Let's start with the raven, says Jesus, which means to allude to two Hebrew Bible texts that praise God's gracious provision to all living things, particularly in times of hunger. Talking about Job 38 and Psalm 147. Who provides for the raven its prey when its young ones cry to God and wander about for lack of food? God gives the animals their food and to the young ravens when they cry. In other words, there's an economy functioning all the time without our intervention. It's the great economy. Moreover, the prophet Elijah is fed by the raven. This is God feeds the raven feeds the prophet. You gotta love that. A story that takes place during a famine, and which is followed by a feeding miracle in 1 Kings 17. So, birds don't know nothing about the rich man's storage rooms or barns, but God's economy works. We're then cautioned against imagining that we can add, the Greek word is prosteo, from where our term prosthetics. We shouldn't imagine we can add a single cubit to our stature, a metaphor probably pertaining, alluding to lifespan, as in Psalm 39, which, not surprisingly, is a reminder that we can't take our material possessions with us into death. Surely for nothing, says the psalmist, we are in turmoil. We heap up and we do not know who will gather. How fleeting are our days. While the ancients understood that we cannot truly engineer or alter our lives in significant ways, we moderns still labor under the fantasy that we can, and so we eschew any notion of limits and hurtle forward in direct defiance of Jesus' grave warnings against doing so. Here comes the second example. It's the lilies. These wild lilies bloomed around the Jordan Valley in early spring. Significantly, images of these lilies adorn Solomon's great temple. Significant because this flower is about to be contrasted with that temple. Lilies, says Jesus, do not engage in hard labor such as spinning cloth. But I tell you, says Jesus with rhetorical insistence, Solomon in all his glory was never wrapped around like one of these. This refers to the sumptuous royal garb of Israel's greatest king, and is probably a euphemism for the great Solomonic temple which wrapped around the king, the zenith of Israel's civilizational aspirations. Stay with me, folks. This is not meant as a hyperbole. Jesus is asserting that the greatest technological, political, or social achievement known to his Judean contemporaries had less intrinsic value than one wildflower in the divine economy. holy shit, what if he means it? This is the absolute opposite of a cosmology that legitimizes the routine sacrifice of species to the idols of technological hegemony and economic growth. It is a continuing holocaust of extinction and endangerment. Just in the last few years, the Baiji dolphin, gone. The West African black rhino, gone. The golden toad, and the Pyrenean ibex, and the Spix's macaw, all gone. The World Conservation Union most recent red list includes a quarter of all mammals studied across the globe, almost half of all fish, 60% of all flowering plants, almost 3/4 of all insects, and over 90% of all mosses, the first green things that showed up in Tevin's story of creation. Consider, says Jesus, the spotted owl, or the St. Helena olive. Blather, our severe modern economic orthodoxies respond dismissively. It's not blather. Jesus is invoking the cosmology of Exodus 16, which is the cosmology of indigenous and traditional peoples the world over and throughout history. This way of seeing translated into economic lifeways characterized by symbiosis with nature, sustainable in local production and consumption, and cooperative and equitable work patterns, as has been shown by anthropologists such as Marshall Solins, Paul Shepard, and others. The Bible is doing nothing more and nothing less than recentering us in the oldest wisdom on the planet. Of course, if Jesus is right, our entire modern economic cosmology falls down like a house of cards. The history of progress has been founded on the idea that nature is an object to exploit for our industrial purposes, and that the value is only what we impute through our relentless attempts to re-engineer the biosphere for profit. But here's the deal. Our project has placed both ecological and social systems on the brink of collapse. So who is the fool here? Do we trust in an economic cosmology that sustains human life for 100,000 years or more? Or one that may not last even another 100? Well, Jesus' exhortation not to seek food and drink is a repudiation of the rich man's decadent feasting in the shadow of his barns of greed. All the nations of the world hustle after such things, says Jesus. This is a intensification of the verb to seek. And he is alluding to Roman imperial culture that was indeed awash in anxiety, alienation, and addiction, just like we are. We're taught to compete incessantly in order to accrue private wealth, in order to satisfy engineered appetites. The divine caretaker, on the other hand, just wants to gift us with enough. I think it's important, parenthetically, to note that Jesus does not dismiss human material life by invoking some heroic or ascetic imperative. He emphasizes that God, as a nurturing heavenly parent, is mindful of our legitimate needs. The vision here, as in Exodus 16, is of enough. Instead, seek the kingdom, which is to say, the great economy. Everything will be added to us. We who cannot add a single day to our lives through anxious managerial accumulation. The rich man secured his food and drink by playing the market to his advantage, but he could never be sure he had enough. Disciples are to resist anxiety by trusting in the divine provision of enough for everyone, which is God's good pleasure to gift us with. We do not need to be afraid. How do you think this stuff will go down in your church? Well, it turns out it's in the book, right in the pew in front of us.